Many subjects to deal with, so many themes to cover, and so many deep-seated questions to address. That's what life really boils down to oftentimes. Right from the time we're young and little, in fact, we start asking questions. What do these words mean? Why does this mean that? What happens when so-and-so dies? Why does love go astray? What happens when disease takes over? I mean, these questions haunt us, and even the little ones oftentimes will ask parents and stymie them with the difficulty of those questions. We're a team of Christian apologists, about 47 full-time, and there's about 25 beyond that who we have adjunct relationships with. And this ministry exists in order to deal with the hard questions of life. People often say to me, have you ever had any doubts? Because of the nature of my conversion, when I was 17, as some of you may know, on a bed of suicide, I can be very honest with you. I have never had doubts about who God is and what He does for the human heart. Have I had questions? Yes. You struggle through questions in life, try to work it out, trying to bring coherence to everything that you believe. And I've got some of my colleagues here tonight, Michael Ramsden, who is our international director, and hopefully taking just more and more major responsibilities. We've been colleagues for over 20 years in this ministry. Michael is Oxford-based, does a remarkable job, and takes a heavy load off me in the leading of our entire team. He really gives the leadership to that team. Only calls upon me if I ever have to make some decisions on the nature of the ministry and so on, but he leads that. And then Dan Patterson is here, my colleague from Brisbane. My close friend and colleague Sanj Kalra is here. He actually does wears twin hats. He's both a development man for our team and also a remarkable testimony and speaker. He's the only one out of all of us who has the privilege of having his daughter with him. So Hallie is here on this trip. They live in Akron, Ohio, and we've had a lot of great laughs together. And Michael's traveling colleague is also here, Jim, and my traveling colleague, Thomas. So there's a handful of us. We've already enjoyed your Manuka honey, and tomorrow I'm going to enjoy a trip to Mosgiel. Now, many of you may want to, I knew I'd get a laugh out of that. Many of you may not know one of the greatest English essayists who ever lived, F.W. Borum, pastored for 12 years in Mosgiel. He happened to be the last person Charles Haddon Spurgeon interviewed and sent on to the ministry. He pastored here in Mosgiel for 12, went on to Hobart in Tasmania, and then in Melbourne. And Billy Graham made a comment when he arrived in Melbourne in 1959. He said, if there's one person I want to meet before I leave, it's F.W. Borum. If you have not read any of his essays, Google his name and pull him up. His books are harder and harder to find. He's written 55 volumes of them, some of the most brilliant essays on the most varied themes you can ever imagine. So one of the dreams of my life was to get to Mosgiel. And I will be doing that tomorrow. It's no small feat, yeah. When I told my wife that, I was talking to her. She's, of course, in Atlanta. She was traveling. She said, what a thrill for you. It was a great honor for me to meet Malcolm Muggeridge. It was a dream of mine to meet him, Leonard Ravenhill, the great Irish evangelist, Billy Graham. And one by one, you just chalk up these things and say, Lord, you know, for a young kid who was born in a tiny street in Chennai, India, and raised in Delhi, to have these kinds of dreams fulfilled, you'll never know what it means until you yourself experience it, and I'm sure some of you have experienced that. The theme is very specific. I'm going to angle into it. I would not address it directly the way maybe you might be expecting me to address it. I'm a Christian apologist. I come into these from various angles because I think they do address the question, but they address it in a very different way. If I were to really speak to you on the confidence in the gospel, I could easily go through why I believe the Bible to be true, why I believe in the resurrection from the dead, why I believe in the transformation of the human heart, all of those things, and they will be very meaningful. But in India, we think very, very differently. We don't think in a linear fashion. We think in a clustery, configurative way. We start off from a hub and we go out into the spokes, and at the end of it all, the wheel pulls it all together. So I'm going to spoke out on one of these things, because I believe when you answer a question, there are many other questions that are subsumed under the basic one. And if you were to ask me today, what is the most unanswered question of our time? What is the most unanswered question of our time? I have no hesitation in telling you that question is, what does it mean to be human? We don't have the answer to that. You go to a university campus and take about 5 different students, you'll get all kinds of different answers. We talk about humanism. What is the ism of the noun? What does it mean to be human? We talk about human rights. What does that mean? We are assuming that there are definitions that we have all agreed on, and we haven't. We have to agree on this question. And I'm going to raise the question and tell you why I believe we can have confidence in the gospel, because it is only the gospel that really addresses this question at its core, and from that there are imperatives that follow. The essence defines existence, not the other way around. The existentialists totally misconstructed reality. For them, sort of existence defined essence. What you choose to do defines whatever you want to be. That's not what the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us that we have to be thinking after the things that are noble, true, good, pure, lovely, that we are really created imago Dei, we are created in the image of God. And if we don't answer this question, it doesn't really matter what other ethical questions we answer. Because essence has to define existence. Who I am gives me the imperative of how I must behave. What do I mean by that? I'm a married man. My wife is Margie. That alone tells me how I am in an essential relationship. That then defines how it is I have to behave outwardly in all other matters that would threaten that one relationship. And if you don't come to terms with that, we end up with a world that we now have, where for the first time, numerous issues are left unanswered and undefined. After 5,000 years of civilized history, we have become the first generation that has redefined so many things that were very clearly defined for 5 millennia, and we have changed those definitions. And it all comes out of the fact that we have lost our way, and we do not know what it means to be human. The story is told of a man by the name of Andres Tamas, who was a Hungarian prisoner of war in the former Soviet Union. He had got into that, he had become a prisoner when he was about 18, I think, and he was released in his 70s. So he'd been a prisoner, he had been there for 55 years, and a lot of that time he had been in solitary confinement. So when they were opening up the prisons in the former Soviet Union in the year 2000, and they were emptying out, they wanted to kill this man because they said he was totally insane. But somebody pleaded and said, why don't we bring a Hungarian psychiatrist? Let them examine him before you do away with his life. So they brought a Hungarian psychiatrist in, they examined him, and the man said, he's not insane. He's not talking gibberish. He is talking an old Hungarian dialect. If anything, you have nearly made him insane. Give him back to us, and we will make him well. So they released the papers, and he was put into a wheelchair, and as he was being wheeled out, he made his first request. If you haven't read his story or heard me tell it elsewhere, you would never really guess what he asked for. The first thing that he asked for was a mirror, because he hadn't seen himself in half a century. So a strong, virile, vibrant youth, age 18, now 73. And so they give him a mirror, and he takes a look at his face. He couldn't stand it for more than a split second. He turned the face of the mirror down, covered his own face with his hands, and burst out into uncontrollable sobs. You see, you and I take it for granted, don't we? We wake up in the morning, look into the mirror, put on all innocent forms of disfigurement, and then we walk out of there to be seen the way we wish we were always seen. And so we take a look at that and we make adjustments, we make changes out of respect for others and out of self-respect too. Is there a mirror for the soul? Has God given us something to tell us what we were meant to be? And I'm going to sustain for you that the confidence I have in the Scriptures is so deep. It's the only source from which I can find my definition and my explanation of who I am and why I think the way I do. The psalmist says this, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you visit him? Fascinating that he reverses our order. Today people would probably see, when I look at men and women, and then I lift into the heavens and I say to myself, what is the heavens, you know? And we've started exalting the environment and losing the valuable inhabitor of that environment. It is not a case of either or. Yes, we protect the environment. It is our home. But how much more important to protect the entity, not the quantity. As, not Bernard Shaw, I think it was Chesterton who made the comment. He said, you can admire a sunset, but the sunset will never return the compliment. You can sit and stare at the heavens in awesome wonder. The heavens will never turn around and look at you and me in awesome wonder. But the psalmist, the sweet singer of Israel, says, what is there in man? What is there in us that you're mindful of him? You have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. This glory and honor that our Creator has crowned upon us, it is that we have to think about. You know, think of the great Stephen Hawking. If a naturalist ethic had been put into place and somebody had predicted that he was going to suffer from Lou Gehrig's and with this disability, or somebody would have probably argued for his elimination in the womb. I've no doubt about it. Because that's all they would have known. They would not have known of the enormity of the mind of this man, who can repeat equation after equation after equation for 20 to 25 pages, and then pause and tell his secretary to go back 20 pages and change one number. It is the moral framework that kept a man like that alive from the beginning, and a moral framework that has sustained a life like this. I often think of the number of lives we may have eliminated. And when we stand before God and say, how did you allow cancer? How do you allow this? How did you allow all of that to happen? And he might well look at us and say, do you know the number of people I sent to you who were going to find you cures for all of those things? You wouldn't even withstand my son. And you wanted to do away with him. We think we know so much. We really know so little. When my father passed away, hours before he passed away, I was driving him to the hospital, and he had this premonition. He was only in his 60s that he wasn't going to make it. And he said to me, I may not see you again alive, son. And I said, Dad, why are you even talking like that? But it turned out, and then it turned out to be true. And here's what he said to me. He said, when I knew you as a little boy, I made so many mistakes. I thought I knew so much. He said, your Heavenly Father knew a lot more about you than I did, and I'm sure glad he won out. We need to humble ourselves and recognize we know very little, but God has crowned every one of you with glory and honor. How do I see this story? I see it in 4 simple terms. Number 1, I see it in the creation narrative, that we are created by God for a purpose. And that tells me at least 2 things. We have intrinsic worth and reflective splendor. Intrinsic worth and reflective splendor. This worth is not given to me by the state. It is not given to me by the United Nations. It's not given to me by any political quantity or entity. It's given to me by God himself, that I am a person of intrinsic worth and I have a splendor to reflect for which I am created. Now, in that intrinsic worth, there are two angles we need to look at. The number one, we know very much that we bear the image of God in the Christian terms and the Christian sense. What that really means is at least a double-edged reality. Number one, we live with a moral framework, and number two, we have self-determination. We live with a moral framework, and number two, we have self-determination. So we know the generality of the imago Dei and the image of God. But here's the reality in the Christian framework, that we are given a particularity and a particular value that is distinctive of each and every one of you. That's why we refer to ourselves as individuals, which means we cannot be divided up. We cannot be carved up. We have that specific composition that is not replicated in anybody else. You see, when a child is lost, you may have another child, but you never ever replace the one that is lost. There is a value and a distinctive splendor to an individual life. Please draw contentment in the fact that you are hardwired and softwired the way God intended you to be. My ethnicity is God's gift to me. I did not choose it. It's his blessing and gift in my life. I have to celebrate it and accept it, that this is the way he has made me. I did not choose to be born where I was born and when I was born. It was purely under the sovereign will of God. Now, I want to illustrate this, what I mean by all of this. It was in 2006 that this story happened. My son, Nathan, he's the third of our three children. We have two girls, Sarah, Naomi, and Nathan. Nathan went to Taylor University in Upland, Indiana. He had graduated a few years before this happened. In 2006, a handful of students were coming back at the end of a weekend, and they were being driven in one of the college vans. It's out in a sort of desolate place, Taylor University. And they were coming along this single-lane highway or something, and a truck, a big massive truck, crossed over the median and slammed into this van, and just about all of them were killed. But one or two of them made it, and one of them was a girl called Laura Van Ryn, but badly mangled and so on and so forth, and she is lying in the bed, and her parents are told that she is still alive. And so the Van Ryns arrive with, as far as I remember, her boyfriend. They were by her bedside for days. But as she was coming to, they would be talking to her, and the boyfriend kept saying, something is not right. Something is simply not right. It doesn't even look like Laura. And they went in, they said, what do you expect? She's badly banged up and all, hair matted and everything. Yeah, blonde hair, and the color of the eyes was the same, but he said, doesn't look like Laura to me. Well, one day, when the girl was listening to them and talking to them, she said to them, why do you keep calling me Laura? I'm not Laura. My name is Whitney. My name is Whitney Sirac. And this just stunned them. So they called the authorities and said, was there a girl by the name of Whitney Sirac in the van? He said, yes. He said, you better call the coroner. We've got a problem on our hands. The girl that you told us was our daughter Laura. He says, she's not Laura, she's Whitney Sirac. So the coroner was called, and sure enough, he hadn't done the DNA testing and gave the wrong information, and he had the wrong name, the wrong girl. And so all of a sudden, the Sirac family that had already conducted the funeral for their daughter and buried her had actually buried Laura in that grave, calling her name Whitney. And now, all of a sudden, the Van Ryns, who thought they had their daughter, find out it's not the daughter, and they go to the grave, and the names have to be changed and all of that. You see, life is intrinsically valuable, but there's a particularity to your life in the eyes of God. That's how God sees you and me in the Judeo-Christian worldview. You didn't give yourself life. You were given a name, but the life was not given to you by yourself. And in the gospel story, when we say, what is there in man that you're mindful of him? It is for this very reason that he looks at the glory that is in humanity, but he often changes the names of the people. You were Saul, you will be Paul. You were Simon, you will be Peter. He considers the essential strength within you, and the name was then given for the mission and the calling to which he was leading you. And so tonight I want to say to you, you can draw great confidence in the love of God, that you are not here by accident. You weren't born in any home undesigned. He knew you from before you were in your mother's womb, and he has a particular vision for your life, which if you will truly receive and accept, you will find that fulfillment, that he has made you for a purpose, and he will fulfill that purpose in you. I wrote a book called The Grand Weaver, and I think in that book I told this story, if I'm not mistaken. My family has always been a great lover of dogs, and I've always had a challenge with that because I've lost a lot of my valuable things to our dogs. But we had one of these puppies, and I had gone to Thailand once on a trip, and I saw a beautiful piece of jewelry for my wife. And not expensive, but the stones were so colorful. The ties are very delicate in their designing. So I bought my wife that, and I was waiting for the right day to give it to her. And I gave it to her in the kitchen that night, and she was so enthralled by it and left it on one of the side tables there in the kitchen, and she was so happy. I wake up early. And so I went to make myself a cup of coffee, and I'm hearing this crunching. Yeah, you guessed it. I said, what is this crunching noise? And this was a puppy. And I looked in the direction of the puppy, and that beautiful piece of jewelry was now garbage. She had chewed this thing up, and she just looked up at me. What do you say? You know, Sir Isaac Newton had done a lot of work on a lot of research, and he piled it up on a table with papers and left his candle there when he'd gone to get himself some tea or something. And by the time he came back, the dog had knocked that table, and the candle fell over and burned a stack of his papers. And he looked at her, the dog, and said, you will never know what you have done. What else can you say? The dog has no recognition of the substance of what has been lost. When I say to you that every hair on your head is numbered, and God says that to you, what he's really saying to you is, he knows you through and through. Intrinsic worth, reflective splendor, the particularity of your value. Isn't that such an incredible truth needed for our time by virtue of creation, where individuals are disposed and all kinds of tensions now abide? Number two, from creation we've got the incarnation. With the incarnation we see two things: the absoluteness of the moral law and the supremacy of love. The absoluteness of the moral law and the supremacy of love. The moral law exists whether we like it or not. We simply cannot ignore the moral law. It is there. And so when a man takes a sword and chops off a person's head in front of a television camera and says he's doing it for his political theory or his religious view, you stand there and just say, when did you go so insane? When did this happen to you? How did you lose the value of this life and don't even have the courage to show us your face? You cover your face and lop off one head after another and dehumanize individual. There's a moral law that exists, but beneath it all is the supremacy of love. Only in the gospel do you have one who pursues and comes and seeks to save that which was lost. He leaves the 99 to go looking after the one, but he comes pursuing you in a way till you and I can recognize what Francis Thompson says. I've led him down the nights and down the days. I've led him down the arches of the years. I've led him down the labyrinthine ways of my mind, and in the mist of tears I fled down titanic glooms of chasmed fears. From up vistayed hopes I sped from those strong feet that followed after. And he ends his poem by saying, thou, poorest, blindest, meekest, I am he whom thou seekest. Thou dravest love from thee that dravest me. You drive me away and you drive love away. You drive me away and you drive love away, says Francis Thompson. Last year in December, I was speaking at the Mother Teresa Awards for courage in the face of terrorism. Every speaker was a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh. I was the lone Christian voice out there to speak. And they were talking about this young boy who laid down his life for his friends in Bangladesh. A band of these thugs came in and asked them to repeat some sacred verses from their holy book, and if they couldn't repeat it, they were gunned down in cold blood. And one of these guys, who was having some friends of his from America, knew those verses, but he knew if he repeated the verses, he would be set free and his guests would be murdered. So he never repeated the verses and paid his life along with them. The mother and his brother were there to receive the award. I had the tremendous privilege of talking with them, praying with them, giving them one of the books, and we're in touch. So I told them, I said, it's a marvelous thing when a man is willing to lay down his life for his friends. Which of us wouldn't want a friend like that? But it's fascinating in the scripture story how one laid down his life for his enemies and pursued and came to lay down his life for you and me while we were yet sinners. There were people in the audience who had been there in 2008 in Mumbai when a band of terrorists broke into 2 or 3 hotels and slaughtered a whole lot of them. In the 2 of the most beautiful hotels of Mumbai, the Oberoi Hotel and the Taj Mahal Hotel. I've stayed at both of them. They're magnificent. Today there are plaques. My team has stayed there. There are plaques in the walls to commemorate what happened that day. Here's what happened in one instance. These guys went into the dining room and the people were having a great evening enjoying dinner, and they started to mow them down. One of them was an Indian actor, but he was an Indian-born English actor. He also dove for cover. And I heard him a few days later being interviewed, and here's what he said. All of my friends were bloodied and killed. They were slaughtered. I dove for cover under the table. I don't know why I was not shot. And so the woman says to him on the television, that is strange, isn't it? You were piled up on top of all of them, and he walked over. He said, yeah, I heard the feet of this man coming. And he was kicking bodies around. And with his guns aimed, he was shooting. He said, I don't know why he never shot me. So the only thing I can think of, I was so covered with everybody else's blood that he took me for dead and therefore did not pull the trigger. I said, in every great truth, there is a greater truth to look to. And I said, you and I, covered by the blood of Jesus Christ, are rescued and raised again to new life because he has paid with his life. Fascinating to see an audience of speakers, all of whom were a different faith, sitting and listening in stunned silence. And the Christians just came up to me afterwards and said, we've never had anyone ever share the gospel with people like this before. The president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, was there, former president. He reaches out to my hand and says, give me your card. We need to have a message like this in Afghanistan as well. The shedding of Christ's blood for you and me. So it's not only the creation, it's the incarnation that gives us such confidence of our value and our worth, where the Word became flesh and dwelt among us full of grace and truth. You will not hear this anywhere else. And then you see transformation, that God changes the heart. God changes the heart. What a remarkable story of the gospel. That's what the gospel is all about. That he enters into your life and transforms your hungers and transforms your desires and gives you a new life. I was referring to my colleague Sanj here. If you heard his story, it was just one disaster after another, one wrong choice after another, one messed up decision after another, till he was spiraling down on the verge of taking his own life. Yeah, he had all the success, all the riches, everything. But he didn't have real life, and he was losing his home, a family, and everything in the process. He literally got on his knees in a church with a pastor and held on to his feet, and he said, I'm not leaving here till you tell me how I can find my way back. And there's an African-American pastor in Akron, Ohio, who led him to Christ while he was on his knees begging to find answers. I've spoken at one of the bloodiest prisons in America, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It has over 5,000 prisoners. More than 80% of them are on life without parole. Imagine that. So there'll be over 4,000 of them on life without parole. Death row is crowded out with some of the nastiest, grisly crimes that you can think of. My buddies have been with me there. And it's fascinating now to speak there. A man with a huge girth of a southern sheriff came and took over the wardenship and said, I'll change it. He said to the governor, if you'll let me do this my way. He said, do whatever you want. Because at that time when prisoners were brought in, they were given a knife to protect themselves. There was blood on the ceilings, blood on the carpets, blood on the walls. These guys were nasty guys. The warden comes in, takes over. First thing he does is build a chapel for them and has chapel every day. He builds a seminary there for them and puts in Bible studies, and they're all broken up into Bible study groups. You go into every cell, there's a Bible. You go into death row, they're reading the Bible. And one of those about to go onto death row paints 2 paintings. And you go into the room where they're about to be executed and his paintings hang there. There's a painting of Daniel in the lion's den that he painted, beautifully done. And I asked, why did he do that? He said, because God can still rescue you. I said, what if he doesn't? He said, look at the other wall. That's Elijah going up on chariots of fire. It's a prisoner. So if he does rescue me this way, he's going to rescue me that way. You listen to them singing, listen to the music. While we were there last time and we were speaking, they cook for us. Now that's faith. They cook for us and we eat. And we're standing in line, and the guy behind me, I said, why don't you go on ahead? He said, hey man, I'm not going nowhere. You are going out of here, so you go first. He's doing his PhD on Augustine in the prison. And they tell me that the bands of criminals have been changed into bands of pastors. When you listen to their music and listen to the worship, and they will tell you they're really not going anywhere, but they have been rescued and their hearts have been transformed, and the joy with which they sing and hug you and embrace you and welcome you. You don't ask anything from you. These guys have got tattoos, all of them big muscles bulging like watermelons sitting around there. And the guy's biggest strength is their heart for Jesus Christ. You watch them taking notes in their lectures at the seminary and tears will fill your eyes. God changes the heart. Creation, incarnation, transformation, and lastly, consummation. There's a hope. God gives you the hope here and of a life beyond. Tell me any other worldview that pulls these 4 truths together to answer the question, what does it mean to be human? You are created by God. The Son of God came to seek after you. He offers to transform your life and tells you he will take you home to himself, that where I am, you may be also. The glory of heaven awaits all of us when we know him. When my mother passed away so suddenly in her 50s, my father asked me to speak. I was struggling, and I said, Dad, I only keep thinking of one word, gone, she's gone. He said, that's right, son. But that's not the end of the thought. Go back and ask God to help you complete the thought. My dad was a latecomer to Christ. So I got on my knees and I thought, gone, gone, gone. And I sensed God so clearly saying to me, gone where? Gone where? And the thought that filled my heart was, gone home. She's gone home to be with her Lord. For those of us who are traveling people, the word home says it all. That's where we ultimately return. We go home. There's a story told by a great American football coach, Lou Little, who was coaching this great college team, winning all of its games. There was a guy in there who was a second stringer, and Little used to watch him often. And he would watch his father come to visit him, and this guy, big guy, would be taking his father around, and he'd see them, the son describing the buildings and all of that. And he said, I always wanted to interfere, go and meet the dad, but I felt they were so close, I didn't interfere. So one day this young man comes to my office and says, Coach, my father has passed away. I was very close to him. Do you mind if I skip this Sunday's game? I'm a second stringer anyway. Go for the funeral. He said, that's all right. You can go. He comes back after the funeral. He goes to see the coach again. He said, I have a favor to ask you. Will you let me play next Sunday? Just one game. And the coach said, I can't do it. You're not a first stringer, and there's a guy ahead of you who's better than you. He said, Coach, put me on the field. If I'm not the best player on the field, you yank me. Just let me play this one game. And a little bit out of sympathy, he allowed the guy. He turned out to be the man of the hour, brilliant in his execution of the game. So the coach called him after that. He said, you did that for your dad, didn't you? He said, yes, sir. But you see what? My dad was blind. And this is the first time he was going to see me play. And I wanted to play this one for him.